They called him the last great enemy of Rome. For 15 years, one man tore the Roman Empire apart from the inside. He murdered an emperor. He broke the loyalty of Rome's most elite soldiers. He turned the Eternal City itself into a battlefield. And if just a few battles had gone differently, he might have ended Rome a century before the barbarians ever crossed its frontiers. His name was Magnus Maximus. No, Eugenius. None of them. The man who almost killed Rome wasn't a barbarian king, or a foreign invader, or even an enemy general. He was a Roman soldier, a brilliant cavalry commander. A man so loved by the legions that they raised him on their shields and called him the true Augustus. His name was Was Flavius Stilicho, and this is the 15-year nightmare he unleashed. To understand how one man could come so close to ending Rome, we need to start not with Stilicho himself, but with a funeral, the funeral of an emperor. The year is 395 CE. The Roman Empire is old, nearly 750 years since its legendary founding, and almost 400 years since it became a republic turned empire. But this Rome is not the Rome of Caesar and Augustus. This Rome is divided. 2 imperial courts, 2 capitals, 1 empire in name only. In the west, from the ancient city of Rome, and later from Milan and Ravenna, rules the Western Emperor. In the east, from the glittering strategic hub of Constantinople, rules the Eastern Emperor. But there is one man who, until now, holds both halves together. Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule over a united Roman Empire. He is a soldier, a reformer, and a devout Christian who has made Nicene Christianity the official belief of the empire. Yet Theodosius is dying. He is only in his late 40s, but years of war and illness have taken their toll. On his deathbed, he looks not at veteran generals or seasoned politicians, but at his sons. Arcadius, perhaps 18 or 19, in the east. Honorius, only about 10 years old, for the west. Children, boys who will inherit an empire crumbling at the edges. But Theodosius believes he has a solution. He entrusts both young emperors, especially the boy Honorius, to one man, a trusted general, a man of mixed Roman and Vandal blood, a man known for loyalty, discipline, and skill, Flavius Stilicho. At first glance, Stilicho is everything Rome needs. He has spent his life in service to the empire. He has risen from the cavalry ranks to become Magister Militum, master of soldiers. He has even married into the imperial family, taking Theodosius' niece, Serena, as his wife. In that moment, as Theodosius breathes his last in Milan in January 395, Stilicho becomes more than a general. He becomes the guardian of an emperor, the unofficial regent of the West, the man holding the Western Roman Empire in his hands. But what no one knows yet is this. For 15 years, every decision this man makes, every alliance, every battle, every execution, will help decide whether Rome lives or dies. When Theodosius dies, the Roman world does not mourn in silence. It erupts. Because at the very edge of the empire, beyond the frozen Danube, something is stirring. For years, the Roman Empire had allowed large groups of Goths, Germanic refugees fleeing the terrifying westward push of the Huns, to settle within its borders. The deal was simple in theory. The Goths would serve as foederati, allied troops providing soldiers in exchange for land and protection. In practice, it was chaos. Roman officials starved them, cheated them, and used them as pawns. In 378, it all boiled over at the Battle of Adrianople, where the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens was killed and his army annihilated by Gothic cavalry. It was a trauma so great that many Romans believed the end of the world had begun. Out of that chaos rose a new Gothic leader, Alaric. Alaric is young, ambitious, and furious. He feels Rome has never truly honored his people. They bleed for the empire, but they are never accepted as equals. He wants land, he wants rank, and he wants recognition. In the summer of 395, just months after Theodosius' funeral, Alaric leads his Goths on the march. South, into the Balkans, then into Greece. He moves fast. He burns Piraeus, the port of Athens. He threatens the great cities of Corinth, Argos, and Sparta. Ancient temples, once the pride of classical Greece, now stand helpless as Gothic warriors storm through their domains. To the Romans, this is sacrilege. To Alaric, it is a message. We are here, we are strong, and we are not going away. So who does Rome send to deal with this new Gothic king? They send Stilicho. Imagine Stilicho at this moment. He has barely settled into his new role as the power behind young Honorius. The Western army is his to command, but the Gothic threat is in the east, inside the Eastern Empire's territory. Still, in theory, the Roman Empire is one. The Western general rides east to defend the eastern lands. Stilicho gathers troops from across both halves of the empire. He marches into Greece, and he corners Alaric in the mountains of the Peloponnese. On paper, this should be the end of the Gothic problem. Stilicho, the empire's top general, has the enemy trapped. One decisive strike, and history might remember him as the man who saved Rome from its Gothic nightmare. But Rome, at this point, is no longer just legions and logistics. It is ego, court politics, jealousy. Because while Stilicho is in Greece, another man is watching from Constantinople. Rufinus, the chief minister, or praetorian prefect, of the Eastern Empire. Where Stilicho is a soldier, Rufinus is a court politician. Where Stilicho is of mixed Roman and barbarian blood, Rufinus prides himself on his Eastern aristocratic status. And now, from his palace in Constantinople, he sees Stilicho, a Western general, commanding Eastern troops on Eastern soil. He is not pleased. He whispers that Stilicho wants to control both halves of the empire. He suggests that Theodosius will named Stilicho guardian of both emperors, a claim the Eastern court hotly denies. And then Rufinus makes his move. He sends a direct order to the Eastern troops under Stilicho's command. Leave, return east, now. In one stroke, Rufinus rips half the army out from under Stilicho, right in the middle of the campaign. Stilicho is furious, but he is still a Roman officer. He obeys. The Eastern forces depart. The trap around Alaric opens, and the Gothic king amazingly escapes. It is the first major almost in this story. Stilicho almost crushes Alaric, almost stops the future sack of Rome before it can even be imagined. But politics in Constantinople saves the Goth, and Alaric does not forget which Roman general nearly destroyed him, nor does Stilicho. While Stilicho marches home from Greece, a new drama unfolds in Constantinople. Rufinus, thirsty for power, believes the Eastern Emperor Arcadius can be controlled. He practically rules in Arcadius' name. He even plans to marry his own daughter to the emperor to cement his influence. But court politics in the East are a snake pit. There is another figure in Constantinople's halls, Eutropius, a eunuch courtier who outmaneuvers Rufinus behind the scenes. Rufinus also has one fatal flaw. He is hated by the field armies. The Eastern troops Stilicho had been forced to return to Constantinople are now marching home. They are led by a Gothic general in imperial service, Gainas. And Gainas has heard enough complaints about Rufinus to know which way the wind is blowing. In November of 395, as the troops arrive outside Constantinople, Arcadius comes out to greet them. Rufinus walks at his side, proud and unsuspecting. Suddenly, the soldiers surge forward, swords flash, And right there, next to the emperor he sought to control, Rufinus is hacked to pieces. His severed head is paraded through the streets. It is a brutal reminder of a new truth. The real power in the empire is no longer always in the Senate, nor even always with emperors. It lies with the men who command the armies. Men like Gainas, men like Stilicho, men who are supposed to protect imperial power, but who might, if they choose, become kings in all but name. The stage is set for 15 years of civil war, invasion, betrayal, and disaster, and Stilicho stands at the center of it all. Back in the West, Stilicho consolidates his role as the guardian of Emperor Honorius. Honorius is a boy in an emperor's purple, shuffled between secure cities, first Milan, then later Ravenna, a marsh-surrounded fortress city chosen because it is so hard to besiege. Stilicho holds 3 titles: Supreme General, Imperial Father-in-law, and de facto ruler. He surrounds himself with trusted allies. He pushes aside rivals, and he keeps a wary eye on the Eastern Court, where new enemies are emerging. One of them is a general named Gainas, the same man whose troops murdered Rufinus. Another is a rising Eastern official who will one day tower over the politics of his age, Anthemius, future emperor, but for now, still a court figure whose policies influence the empire's direction. But Stilicho's focus, again and again, returns to one name: Alaric. After escaping Stilicho's trap in Greece, Alaric does not vanish. He is given a post in the Eastern Empire, then discarded. He wanders through Illyricum, that borderland between East and West. He is like a loaded weapon lying on the frontier, and both halves of the empire argue over who should hold it. Stilicho, with his army and prestige, could go all in, confront Alaric, and try to finish what he started in Greece. But he doesn't. Instead, he does something far more dangerous. He tries to use him. This is the turning point where Stilicho changes from guardian of Rome to something more ambiguous. On the surface, his strategy seems clever. Stilicho sees Alaric and his Goths as a tool, a threat that can be pointed against his enemies, particularly the Eastern Court, which he believes is slighting the West and dishonoring Theodosius' will. So, instead of trying to drive Alaric out or destroy him, Stilicho opens negotiations. At times, he fights Alaric. At times, he seems ready to crush him. But at key moments, he holds back. He allows Gothic forces to slip away. He entertains the idea of giving Alaric official rank, maybe even control of parts of the Balkans, in exchange for Gothic loyalty to the West. From Stilicho's perspective, this is imperial realpolitik. The Roman army is overstretched. Recruitment from Italy and Gaul is lagging. The frontiers are under constant pressure. Why not turn a troublesome but powerful Gothic force into a client army, aimed where Stilicho wants it? But to many Romans, especially Romans in Italy, this begins to look like treason. They see barbarian mercenaries swelling the ranks of the Western army. They see their general treating a former enemy like a partner. They hear rumors that Stilicho might be trying to govern both East and West, perhaps even marry his daughters into both imperial families. They whisper, is Stilicho defending Rome, or building his own kingdom inside it? These suspicions will not go away, and when the West starts to bleed, people will remember them. Meanwhile, disaster is brewing on another front, the Rhine. On the last day of the year, 406 CE, something happens that will haunt the Western Empire forever. In the cold of midwinter, a huge mass of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, Germanic and Iranian peoples, cross the frozen Rhine River, smashing through Rome's border defenses. The frontier that had held in some form for centuries, the barrier between Roman Gaul and the tribal lands beyond, is suddenly broken. Cities are looted. Countryside is ravaged. Roman aristocrats in Gaul flee south or hunker behind whatever walls remain. And where is Stilicho? He is far to the south in Italy, trying once more to manage the threat of Alaric, who has now turned his Gothic eyes directly toward Rome's heartland. This is the cruel arithmetic Stilicho faces every year. Defend the Rhine, defend Italy, defend the Balkans. He no longer has the manpower to do it all. Some historians argue that by this point, no one could have saved the West. Others argue that better choices, stricter discipline, and a harder line against barbarian factions could have bought Rome precious decades. But the man making the choices is Stilicho, and every choice has a cost. He chooses, again and again, to prioritize Italy and the survival of the emperor in Ravenna. The result? Gaul burns. Spain is destabilized. And in the chaos, a Roman general in Britain named Constantine, later known as Constantine III, sees his chance. He is proclaimed emperor by his troops. He crosses from Britain to Gaul in 407, claiming he will defend the province better than Honorius ever did. In a single chain reaction, Stilicho's compromises and calculations have produced a nightmare. A usurper emperor in Gaul. Invaders storming across the Rhine. Gothic armies prowling in Italy itself. And all of them, in different ways, trace their opportunity back to one fact. Rome's strongest general is no longer strong enough to be everywhere at once. By the late 400s, roughly 408 CE, Stilicho's position is terrifyingly delicate. He still commands the Western armies. He still controls the boy emperor Honorius, now a young man but hardly more capable. He still has allies in the Senate and among some Italian landowners. But the list of his enemies is growing. In the imperial court, one figure in particular stands against him. Olympius, a court official, pious and ambitious, who whispers that Stilicho has gone too far, especially in his dealings with barbarians. Stilicho's army is itself divided between Roman-born soldiers and large contingents of barbarian federates, especially Vandals and other Germanic peoples loyal to Stilicho personally. And then comes the moment that exposes just how fragile this entire system has become. The year is 408. In Constantinople, the Eastern Emperor Arcadius dies, leaving behind a very young son, Theodosius II. Once again, a child sits on the Eastern throne. Once again, there is a question. Who will guide this boy emperor? Who will dominate the Eastern court? To Stilicho, this looks like an opportunity and a danger. If the East chooses a hostile regent, the divide between East and West might become permanent. But if Stilicho could influence the succession, perhaps by traveling east or sending forces, he might restore unity or at least secure Western interests. According to some sources, Stilicho even considers going to the east in person to act as a sort of regent or advisor, an echo of his old claim that Theodosius had entrusted both halves of the empire to him. To his enemies, this is proof of everything they feared. Stilicho doesn't just want to guard Honorius, they say. He wants to rule the empire. At the same time, Stilicho is still trying to manage Alaric, who is now demanding payment and lands in exchange for not marching on Italy. Some accounts suggest that Stilicho is willing to grant Alaric money, and even official titles to use Gothic forces against the usurper Constantine III in Gaul. To practical-minded generals, this is strategy. To traditional Roman elites, and to the growing anti-barbarian lobby in Italy, it looks like blackmail. Paying a barbarian king to fight a Roman usurper. For many in Rome, this is the world turned upside down. Olympius seizes his moment. In 408, while Honorius is with the army in the city of Pavia, modern Pavia in northern Italy, Olympius begins to stir up the troops. He tells the Roman-born soldiers that Stilicho favors the barbarians, that he is plotting with Alaric, that he might even plan to eliminate Honorius and put his own son on the throne. The army, already resentful and suspicious, explodes into mutiny. Units attack Stilicho's supporters. Several of his senior officers are butchered. Blood runs in the streets near the emperor's camp. Honorius, frightened and easily swayed, distances himself from his longtime guardian. Stilicho, realizing the danger, flees to Ravenna, hoping that the city's defenses and his remaining loyalists can protect him. But the tide has turned. The Senate in Rome, always wary of Stilicho's power, does little to help. Anti-Germanic hatred flares. Italian Romans turn on the barbarian families living among them, murdering wives and children of Federate soldiers who had long served under Stilicho. To survive, Stilicho does something few would have imagined 15 years earlier. He takes sanctuary in a church. The man who once commanded tens of thousands of Roman soldiers, who held the empire's fate in his strategy and courage, now huddles beneath the vaulted arches of a Christian basilica, begging for his life. But even sanctuary cannot save him. Agents of Honorius arrive, promising safe conduct. Some sources say that Stilicho realizes the trap, but it is too late. He is led away, stripped of his defenses and condemned. In late August 408, outside Ravenna, Stilicho is executed. The blade falls on the neck of Rome's mightiest general. He dies, according to some accounts, with dignity, accepting his fate, refusing to let his son be killed with him. In that moment, a chapter closes. For 15 years, Stilicho had been the West's shield. Flawed, compromised, sometimes dangerously ambitious, but still a soldier who held back the darkness as best he knew how. With his death, that shield breaks, and the nightmare he helped create comes rushing in. Because while Rome is busy tearing down its own protector, one man is watching, and he is very interested. Alaric. The Gothic king had spent years negotiating with Stilicho, sometimes fighting him, sometimes making uneasy truces. Now, Stilicho is dead. His barbarian Federate troops have been scattered, killed, or driven to desertion. The Western Empire is led by a weak emperor, Honorius, and a timid court faction that has just alienated almost every non-Roman warrior who once defended Italy. What does Alaric see? An open door. In the months after Stilicho's execution, tens of thousands of former Federate troops, especially Goths, Vandals, and others who had served under him, turn their backs on Rome. Many of them go straight to Alaric. Their message is simple. Rome murdered the only Roman who protected us. We fight for you now. Alaric's army swells. He marches into Italy. The Western Empire, still reeling from internal purges and executions in the army, can barely oppose him. Alaric camps outside Rome itself, cutting off supplies, turning the Eternal City into a starving hostage. He doesn't want to burn it. At least not yet. He wants concessions. He wants land. He wants gold. Above all, he wants recognition as a legitimate power within the empire. The Senate in Rome negotiates. Emergency embassies are sent to Honorius, who sits nervously behind the marshy defenses of Ravenna, refusing to leave safety to confront Alaric in the field. For the first time in 8 centuries, the people of Rome experience the terror of a foreign army at their gates, not as a far-off rumor, but as a daily reality. All of this unfolds because the West just executed the man who used to stand between Italy and the Goths. The fear that had always whispered at the edge of Roman imagination now speaks out loud. What if Rome falls? Over the next 2 years, from 408 to 410, the conflict between Alaric and the Roman government drags on in a grim dance of siege, diplomacy, and betrayal. At one point, Alaric actually has a candidate he wants made emperor, a Roman senator named Priscus Attalus. He is proclaimed emperor in Rome itself, a puppet under Gothic control. Statues of Honorius are toppled. Coins are struck in Attilus's name. This is civil war and foreign invasion twisted together. Romans and Goths collaborating to bring down a sitting emperor. Honorius, rather than challenging Alaric in open battle, sits tight in Ravenna. He waits, plots, and watches. Eventually, Alaric grows frustrated with Attilus's inability to deliver real power. He deposes his own puppet emperor, strips his imperial robes, and tries again to negotiate with Honorius. Just as it seems a peace deal might be reached, someone in the Roman court, possibly acting without Honorius' full knowledge, launches a surprise attack on Alaric's envoys. For Alaric, this is the last straw. In August 410 CE, word spreads through the Gothic camp. Rome will not deal in good faith. Rome will not accept a Gothic partner. Rome will only humiliate and betray. And so, the unthinkable happens. In the night of August 24th, 410, Gothic soldiers appear at the Salarian Gate, one of the northern entrances to the city of Rome. Some say enslaved Goths inside the walls quietly open it. Others say Roman guards, bribed or terrified, allow the invaders through. However it happens, the result is the same. For the first time in almost 800 years, a foreign army penetrates the walls of Rome. Alaric's Goths pour into the city. Fires break out. Houses are ransacked. Treasures are hauled away. Some churches are spared, either by Gothic choice or sheer luck. Others are looted. Contemporary Christian writers struggle to describe it. Saint Jerome, living far away in Bethlehem, writes that as news of Rome's sack reaches him, my voice sticks in my throat, and sobs choke me as I dictate. To many Romans, it feels like the end of the world. In a sense, it is not. The Western Empire continues for another 66 years. The Eastern Empire survives almost 1,000 more. But something fundamental has shattered. Rome, the mythic heart of the empire, the city that had once conquered the Mediterranean, has been humiliated before all the world. And if we trace the chain of decisions that led to that night at the Salarian Gate, Stilicho's shadow looms over almost every one of them. So, did Stilicho almost end Rome? Let's step back and look at the 15 years from 395 to 410, from Theodosius' death and Stilicho's rise to the sack of Rome. On one hand, Stilicho is arguably the last great Roman general of the West. He defeats barbarian invasions in Italy. He prevents Alaric from overrunning the Balkans, at least for a time. He tries to stabilize a decaying system with too few troops and too many enemies. Without Stilicho, some historians argue, Rome might have fallen much earlier. He buys time, precious time, for an empire that is already deeply wounded. On the other hand, every strength of Stilicho carries a corresponding danger. His reliance on barbarian federates gives him powerful armies in the short term, but undermines long-term Roman recruitment and fuels resentment among Roman elites. His attempt to use Alaric rather than destroy him is tactically clever, but strategically reckless. He normalizes the idea of bargaining with foreign warlords inside the empire's borders. His political ambitions, whether real or exaggerated, terrify both Western and Eastern courts. His insistence that Theodosius had intended him as guardian of both East and West pushes the fragile imperial partnership toward open hostility. And perhaps most importantly, by building a system where so much of the West's defense relies on his personal relationships with Gothic leaders, barbarian troops, and Roman elites, he makes himself indispensable. When he falls, the system doesn't adapt, it collapses. The Roman leadership, in a wave of fear and hatred, doesn't just kill Stilicho. It massacres his Federate troops' families. It alienates thousands of well-armed warriors. and in doing so it hands Alaric a new army and a perfect justification for marching on Italy. In that sense, Stilicho is like a keystone in a crumbling arch. For 15 years, he holds the structure up. But by concentrating so much weight on himself, by tying the fate of the Western Empire to his own person, he also ensures that when he is pulled out, the arch doesn't gently bend. It snaps. Of course, no single man truly ends Rome. The forces tearing the empire apart, economic decline, demographic strain, military overstretch, religious conflicts, and internal power struggles had been building for generations. But history often turns on individuals whose choices amplify or soften those forces. Stilicho amplified them. His story shows how a man can be both savior and destroyer, often at the same time. How a general can win battles on the frontier and still lose the war at home. How an empire can survive external enemies and be undone by its own fear, pride, and infighting. After Stilicho's death and the sack of Rome, the Western Empire never truly recovers. Barbarian kingdoms emerge in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. Roman emperors become weaker, more dependent on generals and kings who are barely Roman at all. 46 years after Alaric's Goths entered Rome, another barbarian leader, Odoacer, will depose the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 CE. But when that day comes, many contemporaries will barely flinch. By then, the idea of Rome as an unbreakable, eternal power has already been shattered. Shattered, in large part, by the 15-year nightmare set in motion when a dying emperor trusted one man to hold the world together. Flavius Stilicho did not swing the sword that finally killed the Western Roman Empire, but he loosened the joints. He weakened the frame. He made Rome dependent on a single pillar, himself. And when that pillar fell, the entire structure shook. For the people living through those years, from Theodosius's funeral to the fires of 410, it must have felt like watching the end of history itself. For us, looking back, it is a lesson in how empires really fall. Not with one blow, but with years of deals and compromises, of ambitions, fears, and desperate gambles, made by men who believed they were saving the very thing they were, slowly helping to destroy. The echoes of Stilicho's choices would shape not just the final century of Rome, but the entire map of medieval Europe that emerged from its ruins. Because when the strongest man in the empire fell, he didn't just leave a vacancy, he left a power vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped the kings who would build the world after Rome. If you'd like to see more deep dives into the people who almost changed history forever, generals, rebels, and forgotten rulers at the edge of empire, consider subscribing to the channel. Drop a comment if you want to follow up on Alaric and the Goths after the sack of Rome, or on the usurper Constantine III in Gaul. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about how empires rise. It's about how sometimes one person's choices can help bring them crashing down.